can't stand our freedoms and our magnificence and so on and so forth. Anyone who is seriously concerned with these issues, certainly anyone who's a specialist in international affairs or the Middle East, knows that there's nothing new about these answers. You can go way back and find them as far back as you want to go. Obvious place to look, if you want to find out more about this, is the records for 1958. President Eisenhower, in internal discussion, observed to his staff, his words, that there's a campaign of hatred against us in the Middle East, not by governments, but by the people. And there was discussion about this. The National Security Council, the highest planning body, gave their analysis. They said that the reason is that there's a perception in the region that the United States is supporting harsh and brutal and corrupt regimes and is blocking democratization and development, and is doing so because of our interest in controlling the oil reserves of the region. And they said it's difficult to counter this perception because it's accurate. And not only is it accurate, but it should be accurate. It said it is natural for us to support status quo governments, meaning the kind I just described, and to prevent democracy and development because we want to maintain control over the energy resources of the region. So there's a campaign of hatred against us by the people, and that's the reason for it. Essentially the same as what the Wall Street Journal discovered on September 14th, and anybody knew in between. So if you want to listen to some voices outside the cocoon, it's not hard to hear them, and they'll answer the questions about why there's a campaign of hatred against us, whether it's now or in 1958, and in a good part of the rest of the world, where people just don't enjoy being ground to dust under somebody's boot. They don't like it, and it leads to hatred. You can avoid, you can indulge in the fantasies if you like, but that's a choice. You certainly don't have to. Everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, it's a really easy way. Stop participating in it. Just about every government bent over backwards to join the U.S.-led coalition, always for their own reasons. I mean, maybe the most striking case, and the one that really tells you something about Western intellectuals, is Turkey. Turkish troops are now in Kabul, or will be soon, paid for by the United States to fight the war against terror. Why is Turkey offering troops? In fact, they were the first country to offer the U.S. troops for Afghanistan, and they explained why. It was ingratitude, because the United States was the only country that was willing to provide them with massive support for their own huge terrorist atrocities in southeast Turkey in the last few years. It's not ancient history. In fact, it's still going on. They carried out some of the worst atrocities of the 1990s, I mean, far beyond anything that Milosevic was accused of in Kosovo, were carried out about the same time in southeastern Turkey against maybe a quarter of the population, Kurds, who are horribly repressed, and millions of them were driven out of their homes, thousands of villages destroyed, maybe tens of thousands killed, every imaginable kind of barbaric torture. Clinton was pouring arms in. I mean, Turkey became the leading arms recipient in the world outside of Israel and Egypt, which are a different category. And they're very grateful that the U.S. was so willing to help them in carrying out massive state terror. And in reward, they're now fighting the war on terror. The fact that Western intellectuals kind of look at this and not say anything is a really impressive testimonial to the discipline of educated people. And it's a rather striking fact about the West. I don't know if anyone in Japan noticed it, but it's extremely dramatic. Actually, I just had an interview this afternoon with a major German journal, and pointed this out, and pointed out to them, which they ought to know, that although the U.S. was the primary funder of Turkey, Germany was the second. What about that? You want to Everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, it's a really easy way. Stop participating in it. I mean, that alone will reduce the amount of terrorism in the world by an enormous quantity. It's true of just about every country that I know to varying degrees, but dramatically true for the U.S. and Britain and Germany and others. In March, that was the 40th anniversary of the public announcement that the U.S. is attacking South Vietnam, that U.S. pilots are bombing South Vietnam, that they began to use chemical warfare for crop destruction, started driving millions of people into concentration camps. This is all in South Vietnam. No Russians, no Chinese, not even any North Vietnamese, assuming they're not allowed to be in their own country. Just a U.S. war against South Vietnam, openly announced. No commemoration after 40 years, because nobody even knows. It's not important. If we do that to other people, that's normal. It's if they do something to us that the world is coming to an end. But if we do it to them, it's so normal, why should we even talk about it?
And likewise in Japan.
Yeah, same thing. Actually, it's better in Japan. Japan was defeated, and defeated countries are forced to pay some attention to what they did. Victors never are. I mean, take a look at the Tokyo trials. You know, undoubtedly the people were guilty of all kind of crimes, but the trials were a total farce. I mean, from a legal or any other point of view, they were disgraceful. And did anybody try the U.S. criminals? In fact, it's kind of interesting the way Nuremberg, the way the principles were constructed. They had to decide at Nuremberg what's going to count as a war crime, and there was a very explicit definition, and it was conscious. It's not hidden. A crime is a war crime if the Germans committed it and we didn't. So, for example, bombing of urban concentrations was not a war crime because the British and the Americans did more of it than the Germans did, so therefore it's not a war crime. And German submarine commanders were able to bring testimony in defense by American submarine commanders who said, yeah, we did the same thing, and they were therefore free because it wasn't a crime. So if they do it, and it gets even worse than this. I mean, for example, opening the dikes in Holland was considered a war crime properly. But in North Korea, a few years later, after the U.S. Air Force had wiped out the whole country, there was nothing left to bomb, they started bombing the dams. That's a huge war crime. It's much worse than bombing the dikes. It was described, but it was described with pride. If you read the official Air Force history or the Air Force Quarterly and so on, they describe it in gruesome detail, but about what a great achievement it was to bomb these dams, to see the huge flood of water scooping out valleys and to see the rage of the people. So they're Asians who depend on rice. And, here we're really getting them where it hurts. And, it's just like racist fanaticism, but praised. That's just a couple of years after they hanged German leaders who were doing much less than that. Do I simplify all matters by saying that the U.S. acts everywhere as an evil empire? Yeah, that would certainly oversimplify things. And that's why I pointed out that the U.S. is behaving like every other power. The U.S. happens to be more powerful, so it's therefore, as you'd expect, more violent. But everyone else is about the same. When the British were running the world, they were doing the same thing. So say the Kurds. Let's just take the Kurds. What was Britain doing about the Kurds? Well, here's a little lesson in history that they don't teach you in schools in England. But we know from declassified documents, Britain had been the world dominant power, but by the time of the First World War, it was weakened by the war. Air power was just coming along at that time. So the idea was to use air power to attack civilians. They figured that would be a good way to reduce the costs of crushing the barbarians. Churchill, who was then colonial secretary, didn't think that was enough. He got a request from the RAF office in Cairo asking him for permission, I'm quoting it now, to use poison gas against recalcitrant Arabs. The recalcitrant Arabs they were talking about happened to be Kurds and Afghans. Not Arabs, but, by racist standards, anybody you want to kill is an Arab. Poison gas was the ultimate atrocity at that time, kind of the worst thing you could imagine. This was circulated around the British Empire. The India office was resistant. They said if you use poison gas against Kurds and Afghans, it's going to cause us problems in India, which we're having plenty of problems. There'll be uprisings and people will be furious and so on. I'm not going to mind in England, of course, but in India they might. Churchill was outraged by this. He said, I cannot understand this squeamishness about the use of poison gas against uncivilized tribes. It'll cause a lively terror. It will save British lives. We have to use every means that science permits us. Okay? So that's the way you deal with Kurds and Afghans when you're the British. If we run through the rest of the countries, we're going to find the same thing. So it would be surely a mistake to describe the United States as the evil empire. It just happens to be the most powerful force in the world since 1945. If you don't do what we tell you, you'll just be pulverized. We don't care what you think or what you say. The current U.S. leadership is extreme in this respect, but they are quite frankly and openly committed to the use of violence to control the world, and they say so. So, for example, when Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia was here a couple of weeks ago, he tried to persuade U.S. leaders to moderate their support for Israeli violence. And what Abdullah said is there's going to be an uprising in the Arab world. It would be really dangerous for your own interests, like oil. And then their reaction was interesting. I mean, he was dismissed, of course, but on interesting grounds. I mean, he was told, it was reported in the New York Times, you can read it. He was told, what they said is, look, just take a look at what we did to Iraq during Desert Storm. Now we're 10 times that strong. If you want to see how strong, take a look at what we just did in Afghanistan. That's what it's for, to show you what can happen to you if you raise your head. So if you don't do what we tell you, you'll just be pulverized. We don't care what you think or what you say. That's their attitude. And they say so, and it's evident in the actions. And that's not very good for the world or for the people in the United States. There's kind of a background to this. If you read the same authors and many others, they explain further that there's good reason why we should be in favor of American hegemony. The reason is that history has a natural course, and the United States represents the realization of history's purpose. So I'm quoting, and therefore U.S. domination is kind of by logic beneficial to the rest of the world. If you think there's anything new about this, you haven't studied the right history courses. They're just repeating what was said by leading British intellectuals, people like John Stuart Mill and others, at the peak when Britain enjoyed its day in the sun. And the same is true I find the same among lesser aspirants for the prize. That's standard. Whoever you are, the leading intellectuals explain that you represent history's purpose and is therefore beneficial if you rule the world. Well, I'm going to stop. There's a lot more to say about all of this. These are some, not all, of the deep abysses into which we ought to be peering. The good side of the story, which there really is less need to talk about because we all know it and we don't have to congratulate ourselves on achievements, but there have been plenty of them. I mentioned that we're now commemorating the 40th anniversary of the attack on South Vietnam. without any notice. The reason there's no notice is because there was no protest at that point in, say, Berkeley or anywhere else. Nobody cared if the United States was going to start bombing another country and attack it with chemical warfare. That's fine. That's what we do. No American president could conceivably do anything like that today. It took years at that time before any protest developed. Out of that protest and the parallel civil rights movement and other popular developments, big changes took place. One change that the changes that took place over the past 30 or 40 years have made the country a lot more civilized. There couldn't conceivably have been a meeting like this 40 years ago, or probably even 20 years ago. There's been a constant improvement. The place is just a lot more civilized. It continues a historical course. I mean, there's been a long struggle to attain more rights, more democratic control, and it's continuing and probably accelerating. And it's a tendency running counter to the tendency towards destruction. And exactly which curve is going to move up faster will determine the fate of the species. That question is pretty much in the hands of people like you. Thanks.
I think Chomsky is a very careful and thoughtful person. I think it shows that.
He has encyclopedic knowledge. He could speak on any topic and make you think about it. And the amazing thing is, despite all the depressing things he said, that he's optimistic. And that was really wonderful to see.
Noam Chomsky knows a lot about a lot of things.
Sure does,
doesn't he?
Yeah, he sure does.
Oh, it was wonderful. I agree with everything that he said. Thank you.
And he gave us hope that if we just organize and act, there's hope. That's wonderful. I feel better than I felt for months.
It's true even in totalitarian states. You know, like even in a totalitarian state, the media are going to have to be somewhat responsive to public opinion. And it's much more true in a country like ours.
Last question. You don't have any concern that CNN and MSNBC are becoming mouthpieces for the U.S. military?
No, they're much less so than they were in the past. So it's not they're becoming. They always were, and it's less so than it used to be. So like take MSNBC. I mean, you know, since September